From the government, Lee Rowley, who's a minister in the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. In winning the North East Derbyshire seat in 2017, he became the first Conservative MP there in nearly a century. He's previously been deputy chairman of the party. From Labour, Jonathan Reynolds is a shadow secretary for Business and Trade, elected to the Commons in 2010. He also chairs the parliamentary group Christians on the Left. Alan Smith is one of 43 Scottish National Party MPs at Westminster. Having spent much of this century as an MEP, he was elected to the Commons in 2019. He speaks for his party on European affairs. Baroness Sayeeda Warsi is the first Muslim woman to ever serve in cabinet and was also co-chair of the Conservative Party. After 4 years as a minister, she resigned from David Cameron's government over his support for Israel during a previous Israeli-Gaza conflict in 2014. And the award-winning journalist Gabriel Pogrund is Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times. In 2020, he co-wrote a book called Left Out, the inside story of Labour under Corbyn. Welcome to our panellists, welcome to our audience here in Bradford. Great to see you. Welcome to you at home, of course. You can listen to the programme on BBC Sounds after the programme, and also there's always a lively discussion on social media as well. And I want to say tonight, and I've said it before, I'm going to say it again tonight, passions are running high, and I want to make sure that we have a respectful conversation where everyone's views are heard and we're not shouting over each other. So let's go for that this evening. And let's take our first question from Brendan Fletcher.
Is it possible for Israel to defend itself and root out Hamas while avoiding regional conflict and humanitarian catastrophe?
Is it possible? Lee?
The situation in the Middle East is extremely challenging, but it starts from a place on October the 7th where 1,400 people were brutally executed by a terrorist organisation. And we have to start there, and I'm afraid for me, we have to stop there. There's no nuance to that, there's no context, there's no explanation. There is the reality that 1,400 people are no longer with us in this world due to terrorism. And what we've all got to try and do is we've got to try and get through this very difficult period where Israel does absolutely have the right to defend itself.
But Brendan's question in terms of avoiding regional conflict and humanitarian catastrophe, how can that circle be squared, if at all?
Well, Israel has to have the ability to be able to defend itself and to prevent this happening again. And the UK said that we're very clear that we will stand in support of Israel doing that. And what we also have to do at the same time is ensure that the humanitarian challenges which we're all seeing and we all dislike very much and we all want to stop. That's one of the reasons why the Rafah crossing is starting to be opened, why dozens and dozens of goods have been able to get through there, and why the Prime Minister has talked about humanitarian pauses. But you have to go back.
And what does that mean? Can I just ask you, what does he mean by humanitarian?
To try and ensure that there is enough support within Gaza and wherever else it is needed to support civilians. Because
and for how long are you?
That ultimately will be down to people being willing to do that on the ground and whatever is necessary on the ground. And I hope that that is possible. But ultimately, we have to accept that this is a state of war, and it was caused by what happened on October the 7th.
Sayeeda.
I would urge everybody to go out and inform themselves about the Israel-Palestine conflict. It didn't start on the 7th of October. It started. My heart goes out to those families who lost their loved ones and those that continue to wait for their loved ones to be returned because they're being held as hostages. But the only way that we ensure Israel's long-term security is by ensuring that Israel ends the occupation. And the way we end the occupation is by ensuring that we have a political deal on the table and that we end up taking both Israel and Palestine to where it was always intended, a two-state solution.
Jonathan.
To answer Brandon's question, I think the answer has to be yes. Any conflict has to be conducted in accordance with international law. That should always be what we believe and reinforce should happen. I think the scale of the human tragedy here, the suffering on both sides, means we all want to see that come to an end. I don't think you can... I think many of us probably have struggled to sleep this week with the things we've seen, the things we've heard, the scale of that. And you've always got to bring it back to human suffering and every civilian life is of equal value. There's been a lot of talk about a ceasefire this week. I think if that was something which meant that Israel could not try and get those hostages back or left the same threat in place, I don't think that would be allowing Israel to defend itself, and I don't think that would be possible. I do think it's clear right now on the humanitarian question, Brandon, to answer your specific point, that not enough aid is getting into Gaza to meet the needs that are there, and that's why I think the move for a humanitarian pause has been put forward at the UN. That would be the right thing to do to get that aid.
So that's
into
a brief
Gaza.
cessation of hostilities before they resume again?
Well, I think that has to be, given the scale of the challenges in Gaza and, again, the human suffering there, that has to be something that is promoted. Now, it's a shame that the UN, it didn't go through, but that, yes, I think that is essential at this stage. But I also agree with Saida. I think the only way we can not just end this stage of what has been a long-running conflict is to get a political process back up and running, no matter how hard that is. It's certainly not going to be easy, but a two-state solution, that is security for Israel and prosperity and dignity and security for Palestinians as well. That has got to be what we fight for, and it cannot be, no matter how hard we pull away from.
OK. We had a lot of questions on this, and there's a lot of hands up, so I'm going to come around to quite a few of you now. Yes, the woman there.
I just think the really passive language being used by the government is quite disgusting. This isn't a humanitarian crisis. This isn't something passive. This is a brutal bombardment of a civilian population that is half children. And I think it's time that someone start to find a backbone and start saying that this isn't OK. Everybody's condemning the attacks that Hamas conducted. No one in their right mind would say that that was OK. But when do we start condemning the murder of children from the sky? When do we start condemning bombing mosques and churches and apartment buildings? When do we start condemning that?
Who do you make a ceasefire with? This is a terrorist organisation which has executed babies, which has uploaded murders to Facebook. Hamas is an organisation that needs to be taken out of the Palestinian area. There is absolutely zero ability to negotiate with these. They're putting.
How many Palestinian lives?
Hang on, let him speak, and then I'll let you speak.
They are putting rockets next to civilian populations. They are using the Palestinian people as humanitarian shields. There is absolutely no way we can negotiate with them. If you want to free Palestine, if you want a peaceful Middle East, Hamas need to be removed.
Being killed. It's not Hamas we're seeing blown to bits on social media, is it? We're seeing children, women, old people, even, I mean, the men as well, poor fathers with their children in bags.
Exactly, Jewish people.
Hamas are embedding themselves.
That's
within
Yusuf asked, what's the
population.
exchange rate for an Israeli life to a Palestinian life? What does the death toll have to get to before this ledger becomes equal? What is it?
Okay.
Because it's thousands.
Let me come round some more of the audience, please. The man back there with the white shirt, further back in the glasses, yeah.
I absolutely agree that it's horrific that there are so many casualties on both sides. I have to say that I completely disagree. It did start on October the 7th. Whatever happened before is completely separate. This is a war that was started deliberately by Hamas on October the 7th. And I'd just like to ask one question. I'd like to ask one question. What do we really think Hamas expected? They knew exactly what they were doing, and they have made the Palestinians the victims just as much as the Israelis. And the last thing I'd like to say is, Palestinians aren't the Israelis' enemies. There's this fixation that there'll never be peace. There will be peace, but you give me, as an Israeli, as a Brit, you give me somebody who I can talk to who's not going to tell me, on the flip side, actually, I want to exterminate you and I want to kill all your family.
Let's hear from the man in the glasses there. Yes.
I think there is a peaceful side to 2 points. You've got the West Bank, where you've got Mahmoud Abbas, who's prepared to talk dialogue, but it's not going nowhere. And then you've got those that are in Gaza, open-air prison. We hear a lot of rhetoric from the United Nations, and the United Nations is, as far as I'm concerned, puppets. You know,
Puppets of who?
Puppets of the 1%. The 1%, the elite, whoever they may be. However, the United Nations, I mean, the General Secretary made a statement and the backlash he faced. And so, you know, it's difficult to be in a position and be opinionated, especially in the United Nations, who are meant to be seen to be quite equal to everybody. The other point is the conflict did start a long time ago, and I think the perpetrators should be held to account. Britain and France have the biggest accountability to account for in terms of the beginning of this conflict. They were the ones that signed over the agreement to say that Jews were allowed to have a piece of Palestine. Historically, we need to look at it with a clear narrative rather than looking at it from the 7th of October.
Okay. Gabriel.
I mean, look, I would challenge your suggestion that the UN is in any way representative of Israel's interests. I mean, let it not be forgotten, a minister of the Israeli state today called on his general secretary to resign in light of what Israel claimed were comments contextualising what happened. You talked about Jews being given a piece of land. I mean, there are clearly people in the audience tonight who object to the circumstances in which Israel came to exist in 1948. We have to deal with the reality as it exists right now, and that reality is that Israel does exist, and its principal goal as a state is to safeguard the interests and safety of the Jewish people and all of the inhabitants within its borders. So let's just recognise that reality and consider, where do we actually go from here? There are two possible solutions. There's a potential military solution, and there is a diplomatic one. And anybody who talks about a ceasefire has to state in detail what the diplomatic solution looks like. There's been the inevitable condemnation of Israel's response, and candidly, I'll try to be intellectually humble. I have no idea if in the context of asymmetric warfare there is any way of avoiding civilian casualties, although the numbers are horrific and disgusting and heartbreaking. So if you want to avoid more of that, you have to have specific, detailed ideas. And I will say, I find it extraordinary, and it's easy to forget, Turkey is a member of NATO. Qatar owns half the real estate in London. They have for 2 decades hosted large proportions of Hamas's leadership. We have to use not only the West, but our allies in the Middle East and their diplomatic resource to ensure Hamas can... The only way this ends is if Israel can look its population in the eye and say, after this status quo shattering event, the biggest murder of Jews since the Holocaust, they have to... Bibi Netanyahu, whatever one happens to think of the man, and I do not think either side are well served by their leaders, he has to be able to look his public in the eye and say, I've extracted security guarantees. The only way that happens is if Hamas's leadership either leaves or there are massive diplomatically negotiated changes to the reality on the ground, which has been there since 2005.
Okay. Saida, you want to come back in?
I agree with a lot of what Gabriel has said, because I think at the moment what we don't have in Israel and Palestine between Hamas and Netanyahu is that either party is a partner for peace. I want to read something to you. This quote: anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support the bolstering of Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. That was Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2019, supporting Hamas, because he knows that as long as Hamas remains there, he can always argue that there is no partner for peace. During our lifetime, there have been 2 moments when peace could have happened. One was in the early 90s with the Oslo Accords, which were negotiated by Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, and both of them were awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for that. Tragically, 2 years after those accords, a right-wing Israeli settler assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, and after the end of that, the peace process came to an end. The second moment came not so long ago in 2016 when John Kerry, as Secretary of State, put forward a peace proposal. That proposal was accepted by the Palestinian Authority and it was rejected by one Netanyahu. So I think it's really important. I do believe, Gabriel, that there is an opportunity for peace. It's the only way that Israel will secure its long-term future. And I genuinely believe that what we should be saying to our politicians is that you've got to stop using language which actually in the real world makes no sense. It sounds like
Are you including your Conservative?
I'm including the Conservatives and actually the leader
here?
of the opposition. In the real world, it sounds insensitive. It sounds like it's one-sided. It sounds hypocritical, and it sounds like you do not understand the depth of this issue, and it goes no way towards actually resolving the issue. All you do is embolden Netanyahu, a man who is mired in allegations of corruption, who actually in his cabinet has a minister who has been convicted of terrorism, another minister who is a self-confessed fascist, and who are governing on the basis of a coalition agreement which denies the very right of the Palestinian state to exist.
Well, firstly, I'd say I very strongly agree with Saida in everything she's said tonight. I think anyone who thinks that history started a week past Saturday is part of the problem with this discussion. We must look at this in the right. I deplore anti-Semitism, I deplore Islamophobia, I deplore any death of any innocent civilian anywhere. And the SNP, you'll be aware, we take this quite personally because our First Minister, our leader, Hamza Yousaf, has got close relatives, close loved ones in Gaza right now. I grew up in the Middle East. We've got all sorts of connections to the wider region. And in the Middle East, everything is connected to everything else. And I really agree with Gabriel's point that the leadership of the Palestinian sides and the Israeli sides are not well served by their leaders right now. And it's not just two sides.
But in terms of Brandon's question, is it possible for Israel to defend itself and also root out Hamas while avoiding conflict and humanitarian catastrophe? What's the answer to that question?
Well, first off, there has to be a ceasefire in order to allow humanitarian aid in and talks to happen.
And do you think Hamas would go along with that ceasefire?
I think Hamas is now in a position where they're going to have to go along with that. There's already rumours just in the past 24 hours that Hamas themselves are proposing their evacuation to Lebanon or perhaps another third country.
You think they should?
I think they should get out of the equation, absolutely, and that's where there would be agreement on this panel. Hamas is part of the problem. I carry no torch for anybody in this discussion. I'm a gay man. I would far rather live in Tel Aviv than Ramallah. Hamas throws people like me off high buildings. I carry no torch for anybody in this. And none of us should be partisan within this. So war has rules. International humanitarian law has to be the basis of any negotiated settlement. Every single conflict in human history has ended with a piece of paper and a treaty. There has to be negotiation, however tough, however hard. There has to be peace, and the way that you can actually get to a peace is by talks. So there has to be a ceasefire, there has to be a talks-based settlement based on international law, and we need to see that actually taking forward right now because too many people are hurting on all sides.
Man here in the black shirt.
Israel is killing babies and the elderly on a daily basis. Thousands are dying. They're not committing to the international laws. Why is the world standing by while Israel continues to break every law there is and continue with the murders?
And what do you think Israel should do about Hamas?
Israel should have dialogue with Hamas. They should have a ceasefire straight away.
Sorry.
It works. It works. We did have talks with the IRA. It works, and that's going to be the solution.
All right. There's a woman there in the middle. I think you've got a grey sweater on with dark hair. Yeah.
First of all, we'd never, ever in Israel sit down to people who don't recognise our existence. And I totally agree. There is no way that Israel will ever back down to terrorism or negotiate with terrorism. And I wanted to share something personally. That music festival, a very close friend was there. He's 26 years old. He was 26 years old. He went to a music festival. I've got children. Lots of people have probably got children who could go to Glastonbury, have a nice time. This guy went, have a lovely time. He went the year before and loved it. He went this year and was shot dead. His parents are absolutely crushed. They're heartbroken. And this is not negotiable. Israel has a responsibility to its people and everybody who's there to protect them. They didn't start it. They are going in with a heavy heart because they do not want this.
OK, thank you. The man behind you, and the man further back with the green shirt on there. Green short-sleeve shirt, yes.
First of all, I want to condemn Hamas's attack on Israelis. I think the lady's point here about the person that was killed in the music festival is abhorrent. But I also want to make this point clear. Hamas broke international laws. But does two wrongs make a right? Does that still give Israel the right to break international law? And I will have to Mr. Rowley, you know, I completely disagree with this kind of rhetoric the Conservative government's coming out with, because, you know, you're almost justifying, just because Hamas did something wrong, you're giving the green light for Israel to commit wrong. And to Mr. Reynolds as well, the Labour Party's position on this has been absolutely appalling. Keir Starmer on LBC clearly said that they have the right to stop water, electricity and aid, and then all of a sudden he backtracks a week later. Mr. Flip-Flop, as always, he changes his mind, and the Labour Party here in Bradford is collapsing. People are resigning on tap, and there was a report today to say there was going to be 1.5 million votes being lost. And that's really because Labour don't stand for anything anymore. So, my big point...
So let's give you both a chance. I'm sorry, OK, go on, sorry.
And I also want to speak for the Palestinian children. Just as the lady said about the Israeli citizen, I want to talk about a young girl called Habiba. Habiba was 8 years old. She loved babies, and she wanted to be a doctor. And she wanted to learn English so she could tell about the Gaza situation and what's happening in Gaza. She unfortunately was killed in her home while she was sleeping. And I just want to make sure that if Habiba's family is watching, you know, she did have a chance to tell her story here to the British public. You know, we hear her. And this is about children. I don't care. This is not about religion. Stop killing children from each side. There has to be a different alternative. There must be.
Lee, I'll let you both answer.
Two extremely powerful stories from different sides of the divide. And we all want peace. We all want this to end. We all didn't want this to happen in the first place. And to your point, sir, about two wrongs not making a right, you're absolutely right. That's not why I have said what I've said tonight. I've said what I've said tonight because Israel, just like the United Kingdom, has a duty to ensure its citizens, just like you, can go about their day, can ensure they get up the next morning, can make sure that the kind of things that you've described don't happen here in the UK, just like they shouldn't have happened in Israel. And when that is not possible, when they can't defend that, when they're unable to do that, it is absolutely legitimate. It is absolutely legitimate for Israel to ensure.
Hang on, don't shout out. I'll put your point. The man is saying, does that justify a war crime?
Well, I disagree with the concept that that's what's happening. But what Israel is doing is it's self-defense. And if somebody
hang on, I know you disagree, but let him make his point.
If somebody can tell me how Israel, how its citizens can defend themselves tomorrow, next month, next year from Hamas, who will come through that barrier again, who will kill again, and that's why Hamas have to be removed.
OK, let Jonathan come up. I'll let Jonathan answer, because you also made some points about the Labour Party. So the Labour Party is in some difficulty over this. We've got a shadow frontbencher already saying that Labour should be calling for a ceasefire, which it isn't. And you've had a number of resignations, councillors. Dozens of MPs, Labour MPs, have signed an early day motion for a ceasefire. What is the Labour position now?
The Labour position has been the same from the beginning, which is that Israel has that right to defend itself, as I said in my opening answer.
But in terms of a ceasefire or a pause, what's Labour's position on that?
We're not in favour of a ceasefire. We do believe a humanitarian pause is necessary to get aid in, and the position has always been, sir, Israel has to have that right to defend itself. I said that clearly at the start. That must be done in conjunction with international law. That's not negotiable, but that must be done with aid getting into Gaza, whether that's food, fuel and medicine. And language is important at all times. It's particularly important at a time like this, where there's been a query. We've clarified that. I think that is the right thing to do.
And
but
do you think you're convincing your own party, given you've got a shadow front bencher who's resigned today?
I think the position
that person's clearly not convinced.
I think the position is clear. I think this is incredibly difficult. It's a difficult time for any of us to be representing any community, and I think I wouldn't criticise.
Sorry, but has called for ceasefire.
I wouldn't criticise any person trying to express the views of their constituents in a way which will be challenging, and I think, frankly, it's not really about the internal workings of British political parties. We're trying to get that position. Could I just say one thing, though, because there was a comparison made earlier between the peace process in Northern Ireland and the IRA and Hamas. I think it is very, very important to understand that the IRA were terrorists, but they were nationalists, that there was a process that ultimately we could go under. You cannot think of Hamas in the same way. The difference between... The difference between the Palestinian nationalist movement, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas is very, very different, sir.
Hang on, let him answer.
And I just think it's very important to say, you can say, go and talk to them. They would not want to talk to Israel. They would not be interested in a peace process. What they are interested in is the kind of brutal surprise attack that took place on October 7th, and we just have to acknowledge that is the reality.
Gabriel, you want to come back in?
Baroness Varzi had something she wanted to read out, and I've scribbled something in my biro as well. It's as follows. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, "O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." Those words are contained in the founding charter of Hamas. Hamas, in instigating this war, would have been alive to the inevitable consequences.
Hamas is not Palestine.
So you're saying Hamas is not Palestine?
I'm glad that you have said Hamas is not Palestine, because before you interrupted me, I was going to say precisely that. The Palestinian people deserve self-determination and dignity, but you cannot negotiate with people who are avowedly annihilationists when it comes to the Jewish state and the Jewish people, of which I am one, and they don't make any distinction about Jews or Israelis.
No, hang on, please don't shout out, otherwise we won't be able to hear what people are saying.
There are two options. If there's any universe in which Hamas, by the way, in previous contexts, Hamas does negotiate with Israel, often in down hotel corridors in Egypt. There are indirect conversations, but this attack has put a bomb under the status quo, and if there is to be any way out of it, number one, they have to, whether it's off their own volition or pressure from their allies, as I mentioned before, Doha currently houses Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas chief, in an air-conditioned suite in their capital. If there's going to be any way out of this, they have to announce that their avowedly annihilationist, genocidal beliefs, and furthermore, we have to find a way to bring in the rest of the Palestinian leadership, including the Palestinian Authority. And I think, Alan, you talked about Hamas throwing gay people off buildings. They also threw Fatah activists and politicians off buildings when taking over the Gaza Strip. They're not realistic interlocutors for achieving an end goal that sees Israel and Palestinians seeing peace and security side by side.
Okay. The woman here with her hand up.
Ultimately, there is going to have to be dialogue, because people can't just carry on killing each other until the whole of the Gaza Strip has been flattened and there's no one left alive. People do need to talk to each other, and surely the intelligence services and the allies of Hamas know who the leaders are, they know where they are. Those conversations need to start, and a ceasefire has got to be the starting point.
Okay. Woman there in the glasses, yeah.
I think we should remember what Golda Meir said, perhaps change the word from Arabs to Hamas. She said, there will never be peace in Israel until Hamas learn to love their children more than they hate the Jews.
Okay. Let me ask the woman there who just, with the leather jacket on, I think? Yes.
Yes. So we're talking about the diplomatic and the military situation happening in the Middle East. And as somebody who has a background in journalism and political science and who has worked at a short period in the White House and has been at the UN. I'm a huge advocate of free speech. But what happens when free speech becomes hate speech? And where are the limits? What can be done because of what's happening? We're talking about, you know, a whole organization who wants to annihilate, and the things that are happening not only here on campuses and on the cities, but across the United States, the protests that are happening in tremendous, outlandish numbers. What can we do now?
Okay. That's a big question. Not quite what Branda's question was. Half an hour has elapsed, and I'm thinking I'm going to take another question. You want to wait one more point before I do? All right, go on then.
I think one thing that is being missed altogether in this conversation, and politicians everywhere, is who is behind this. And I saw BBC TV, an Arabic presentation with a respondent who, it was with subtitles, and he said, "Why are you talking like this? This is Iran. Iran came into Syria and destroying Syria. Iran came into the Yemen with the Houthi rebels, they're destroying Yemen. Iran came into Lebanon, Lebanon is mostly destroyed. And now Iran is in Gaza. And Hamas is supplied by Iran, and it's also told what to do. And at the moment, there was about to have Saudi Arabia, in the Abraham Accords, was going to sign some kind of peace arrangement with Israel. It was a momentous act of peace. And this whole area of the Arab world was making peace and prosperity with Israel. And Iran could not accept that. And that's when they said to Hamas, now is the time. And unless we face Iran head on and tell them to stop meddling, stop interfering with the Arab world, you're not Arabs, and you're ruining the Arab world. And they've got to back out. We've got to confront them.
Well, we will revisit this subject, I am absolutely sure of, in the coming weeks. Brandon, thank you for your question. I'm going to take another question. There's a lot of you asked about this. Obviously, most of you want to talk about this, and that's why I've given it half the programme. But in order to do justice to your other questions, I'm going to move on now.